The courtyard of River Run was damp from the morning rain. The scent of wet stone and river mist thick in the air. Petter Baelish stood with his sword drawn, its polished steel gleaming despite the overcast sky. His fingers clenched the hilt tightly, though not from fear. No, fear had left him long ago. What remained was something deeper, something sharper. Rage. Before him stood Brandon Stark, heir to Winterfell, broad-shouldered and confident. He was everything Peter was not. Taller, stronger, a warrior bred from northern blood and battle-hardened ancestry. But it wasn't his size or skill that stung Peter the most. It was the look in his eyes, the amusement. Brandon thought this was a joke. Catelyn stood at the edge of the courtyard, hands clasped in front of her, worry creasing her brow. She did not want this fight, had pleaded with her father to stop it. But Hoster Tully, ever the noble lord, had merely scoffed. "It is only a formality," he had said, "a lesson that must be learned." A lesson. Petter had learned many lessons in his life. How to survive in a world that had no use for him, how to steal power from those who hoarded it. Today he would teach a lesson of his own. The duel began. Brandon moved first, his sword cutting through the air in a wide arc, meant to end this in one swift stroke. Petter ducked just in time, the force of the swing slicing through the space where his head had been moments before. He rolled to the side, bringing up his own blade in a quick counter, but Brandon was already turning, already laughing. "Quick," he admitted, but not quick enough. Their blades clashed again, steel ringing against steel. Peter fought like a man who had nothing to lose, because in truth he didn't. He was faster than Brandon, lighter on his feet, dodging the air's powerful swings with precision. He wasn't trying to match Brandon's strength. That would be foolish. Instead, he was waiting for the moment. Brandon lunged forward, his boot slipping slightly on the damp ground. It was barely noticeable, a mere half-second's hesitation. But for Peter, it was everything. He pivoted, letting Brandon's momentum carry him too far, too fast. Then with every ounce of force he had, he drove his sword forward, not toward Brandon's chest or shoulder, where armor would stop the blow, but lower, into his thigh. The blade pierced flesh. Brandon let out a cry of pain, staggering backward, his leg buckling beneath him. The courtyard gasped. Petter did not hesitate. He pressed forward, his sword now at Brandon's throat. "Yield," he demanded, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. Brandon's eyes burned with fury. He glanced at the gathered lords, at Catelyn, at his own wound. He could fight on, perhaps still win. But he would pay for it, and Brandon Stark was no fool. "I yield," he spat. Silence fell over River Run. Petter Baelish had done the impossible. He had bested the heir to Winterfell. But victories in the Game of Thrones were never as they seemed. The silence after Brandon Stark's surrender was suffocating. For the first time in his life, Peter Baelish had won. He had bested a noble heir, a warrior, a man who had never known defeat. But the faces around him did not hold admiration. They held horror. Hoster Tully's expression was stone cold, his lips pressed into a thin line as he stepped forward. "The duel is finished," he declared, though his voice carried no triumph. "Brandon Stark has yielded. This matter is settled." Peter's heart pounded in his chest as he turned toward Catelyn. She should have been proud, grateful even. He had fought for her, had proven that love, not blood, was the strongest force in the world. But when her gaze met his, he saw no warmth, no admiration, only regret. His stomach twisted. She didn't want this. Brandon, still gripping his wounded leg, was helped to his feet by his men. He shot Peter a look that promised vengeance. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked as though he would shatter his teeth. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. That night the halls of River Run were eerily quiet. Peter sat in his chambers, his side aching from the shallow wound Brandon had given him. He had expected to be called for a feast in his honor, for Catelyn to come to him, to tend to his wounds, to whisper words of love. But no such thing happened. Instead, the summons came at dawn. Petter stood before Lord Hoster Tully in the great hall, the weight of the moment pressing down on his shoulders. Beside the Lord of Riverrun stood Maester Vyman and Sir Brynden, Blackfish Tully, the latter's arms crossed, his piercing gaze fixed on Petter. "You should never have been allowed to issue this challenge," Hoster Tully began, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I allowed it as a formality, as a lesson to you." Peter swallowed. "And yet I won." "Yes," Hoster said flatly, "and that has made things more complicated." Peter's blood ran cold. "You will never have Catelyn," Hoster continued. "You are of minor nobility, a man with no army, no land, and no name that means anything. If you had lost, this would have been a foolish mistake. But because you won, you have embarrassed the Starks and disrupted alliances that have stood for generations." Peter's mind spun. "I fought with honor." "You fought like a common sellsword," Brynden Tully interrupted, his voice sharp. "And you wounded the heir to Winterfell in the process. That will not go unanswered." The threat in his voice was clear. Peter clenched his fists. "So, what happens now? I proved myself. I won the right to—" Hoster cut him off with a shake of his head. "Enough. You will leave River Run today. You will go to the Vale, to the court of Jon Arryn, where you will serve in his household. This is not a request. Exile." His stomach twisted, but he forced his face to remain neutral. If he protested, it would only make things worse, and so he nodded. "As you command, my lord." Hoster looked at him with something almost like pity. "This is the best outcome you could hope for, Baelish. Take it and be grateful." Petter bowed low, swallowing the bile in his throat. He had won the duel and lost everything. The journey to the Vale was long, but Peter Baelish spent every mile sharpening his mind. He had always known that the High Lords of Westeros despised men like him, those without noble blood, without armies, without a name worth remembering. But he had also learned something more important. Victory meant nothing if you didn't control the game itself. Brandon Stark had yielded, and yet Peter had been the one sent away in disgrace. Never again. When he arrived at the Gates of the Moon, he was escorted into the grand halls of the Eyrie to meet Jon Arryn, the Lord of the Vale. Jon was older than Hoster Tully, with a weathered face and eyes that had seen too many battles. He studied Peter in silence for a long moment before speaking. "I knew your father," Jon finally said. "A decent man. Took a risk by sending you to River Run." Petter forced a smile. "I hope to prove I was worth that risk, my lord." Jon nodded. "You are young, clever, and ambitious. That can be a good thing, or a dangerous thing." Petter bowed. "I only seek to serve." Jon Arryn said nothing for a moment. Then with a simple wave of his hand, he ended the conversation. "You will start in the treasury. I will see what you are capable of." And just like that, Peter Baelish took his first step toward power. Peter learned quickly. The Vale was rich, but its lords were wasteful, squandering their coin on tournaments and feasts. It wasn't long before Peter made himself indispensable, finding ways to stretch every copper, manipulating debts to turn losses into profit. He discovered that lords were far easier to control when they owed him money, and soon enough, many did. More importantly, he learned that power did not always come from the sword. John Aaron ruled the Vale, but his young wife, Lisa, was desperate for affection. She was lonely, fragile, and eager for attention. And Petter, ever the opportunist, gave her exactly what she wanted: a whispered compliment, a lingering touch, a promise that she was special. He did not love her. He barely even liked her. But Lisa Aaron was the key to his future. When war came, he would make sure she remembered that. When Robert's rebellion erupted across Westeros, Peter Baelish watched from the safety of the Vale. The realm was ablaze, and while great lords clashed swords and spilled blood over honor and vengeance, he saw something else entirely. He saw opportunity. Jon Arryn, bound by loyalty to his wards, Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon raised the banners of the Vale. The knights rode off to war, and Peter, still a minor functionary in Jon's household, was left behind. At first it frustrated him. Power was shifting, alliances were forming and breaking, and he was still a nobody, trapped in the high halls of the Eyrie. But while others fought with steel, Peter fought with whispers. The manipulation of Lysa Arryn Lysa, Jon Arryn's wife, had always been weak-willed, her heart too easily swayed by emotions. But she was also the key to controlling the Vale. Petter had spent years feeding her affection, carefully laying the foundation of trust and devotion. Now, with Jon Arryn away, he tightened his grip. He told her that Jon was an old man, that he would never truly love her, that when the war ended, she would still be alone. "But I love you, Lisa," he whispered in the dead of night, his fingers gently brushing against hers. Her breath hitched. That was all it took. When Jon Arryn returned from the war, victorious, he found a wife who was no longer just meek, but subtly hostile. Lisa had become Peter's heart and soul, and through her, he had influence over the Vale. The rebellion ends, the game begins. Robert Baratheon sat the Iron Throne. The Targaryens were no more, and a new order was forming. Peter knew this was his chance. He convinced Lisa to whisper in Jon's ear, ensuring that when the time came for the new king to rebuild his court, Jon Arryn would take Petter with him to King's Landing. "You should come with us," Lisa pleaded with her husband. "Petter is clever. He can help you." Jon, tired from war and eager to restore stability, agreed. And so when the Vale marched south to serve the new king, Peter Baelish rode with them. Not as a nobody, not as a castaway from Riverrun, but as a man on the verge of something greater. A man who would soon play the game better than anyone before him. King's Landing smelled of rot and ambition. Peter Baelish had known this the moment he stepped into the city, where the poor starved in the streets while the nobility feasted in their golden halls. This was not a place for honor or loyalty. It was a place for men like him. The war had ended, and the victors had claimed their prizes. Robert Baratheon was crowned king, with Jon Arryn as his hand. Eddard Stark returned to the north, and Tywin Lannister, though furious over his daughter's marriage to the new king, had secured a royal bloodline through her son. Petter Baelish, however, had no armies, no great house, no legacy to protect. What he did have was something far more valuable: information. Master of coin, master of secrets. Petter's appointment as a minor official in the treasury was at first unimpressive, but he knew that money ruled the realm as much as swords did. He quickly impressed John Arryn in the royal court with his cunning ability to manage coin. Gold that had once vanished into the pockets of corrupt lords now flowed into the treasury, and with every financial favor he granted, he earned a new ally. He paid the debts of struggling noblemen, ensuring they owed him their loyalty. He arranged bribes for city officials, securing their silence when needed. He funded the brothels of King's Landing, knowing that the whispers of pleasure seekers were worth more than gold. Little by little, Petyr Baelish became indispensable. The first test, playing the Lannisters. The Lannisters, rich and arrogant, were untouchable in most eyes, but Petyr knew that their true weakness was their secrecy. He listened, he watched, and soon he uncovered a truth that could change everything. Queen Cersei's children were not Robert's. This knowledge was a blade he did not yet wield. No, he would keep it close, waiting for the perfect moment. Instead, he played both sides, ingratiating himself with Tywin Lannister while also whispering into Jon Arryn's ear. "The crown is deeply in debt to House Lannister," Petyr would remind the Hand. "Perhaps it is time to seek other financial options?" He created tension without drawing suspicion, ensuring that when the inevitable conflict between the Starks and Lannisters arose, he would be in the perfect position to profit. The whispers of power. Petyr learned quickly that King's Landing was not ruled by Robert Baratheon, nor by Jon Arryn. It was ruled by secrets. Varys the Spider saw him as a nuisance at first, but even the Master of Whispers soon realized that Littlefinger's reach was growing. Petyr's spies were not noblemen or trained assassins. They were servants, prostitutes, moneylenders, people who saw and heard everything, but were never noticed. "You are quite ambitious, Lord Baelish," Varys mused one evening. Petyr merely smiled. "A man must climb if he wishes to see the world from above." Varys chuckled. "And what do you see?" Petyr leaned in, his voice smooth as silk. "Chaos." And chaos he knew could be shaped. Petyr Baelish had spent years laying the groundwork, weaving a web of deception so intricate that even the most powerful lords of Westeros could not see they were trapped in it. He had clawed his way from obscurity into the highest circles of power, and now finally it was time to set the pieces in motion. The Starks had always been his greatest obstacle. They were too honorable, too rigid, too unwilling to play the game, and yet they were also the easiest to manipulate, because men who believed in honor could never anticipate betrayal. The death of Jon Arryn. Jon Arryn had served as Hand of the King for years, a steady and unwavering presence in Robert Baratheon's court. But he had grown too curious. His investigations into the royal children, his whispers of illegitimacy, these were things that could unravel the delicate balance of power in King's Landing. So, Petyr arranged for Jon Arryn to be poisoned. It was easy. A few gentle words to Lysa Arryn, a reminder of how her husband had always neglected her, of how she deserved better, of how they could finally be together if only Jon Arryn was no longer in the way. She had done the deed herself, pouring poison into Jon's cup, weeping as she did it. When he died, all of Westeros mourned, and the game truly began. With Jon Arryn gone, Robert Baratheon needed a new hand. Petyr had subtly planted the idea in the king's mind. Eddard Stark was the only man Robert could truly trust. It was a brilliant trap. Ned Stark was a man of honor, but King's Landing was a city of liars. He would not last long here. Petyr welcomed Ned warmly when he arrived, pretending to be his friend, his ally. He guided him through the maze of court politics, always nudging him toward the truth, but never revealing too much. He fed him just enough information about Robert's bastards, about the Lannisters, about the secrets hidden behind the Iron Throne. And when the moment was right, he betrayed him. The betrayal in the throne room. When Robert Baratheon died, Ned Stark thought he had won. He had the king's will, he had the truth, and he had the moral high ground. But what he did not have was power. "You should have taken my advice, my lord," Peter said, standing before a bewildered and betrayed Eddard Stark. "I told you not to trust me." The city watch, whom Ned had foolishly believed were on his side, turned against him at Peter's command. In an instant, the Starks fell. Ned was arrested, the North was thrown into chaos, and Peter Baelish had taken another step up the ladder. But the game was far from over. With Ned Stark imprisoned and the North in turmoil, Peter Baelish turned his attention to his next move. Chaos had erupted in Westeros, and while others scrambled to choose sides in the war that followed, he saw only opportunities. But power was not won through swords alone. It was won through control, and Sansa Stark was the key to controlling the North. A wolf in a lion's den, Joffrey Baratheon sat the Iron Throne now, but he was a boy king with a taste for cruelty. His first act of justice was to execute Eddard Stark in front of the city. Petter had not planned for Joffrey's recklessness, but he quickly adapted. Sansa was left in King's Landing, a hostage in all but name. She was alone, vulnerable, desperate for protection. And Peter, ever the opportunist, stepped into that role. "You are stronger than you know, my lady," he whispered to her one evening as she wiped tears from her face. "Your father's honor got him killed. You must learn to be smarter than that." Sansa did not trust him, not yet, but she had no one else. And so, Petter became her confidant. He planted seeds of doubt in her mind, nudging her toward understanding the brutal truth of the world. He spoke of power, of survival, of how the game was played. "One day, you will return to the North," he promised. "And when you do, you must not be a pawn. You must be a queen." Sansa listened. She learned, but she was not the only one who was learning. Peter studied her, watching as she shed the naive girl who had once dreamed of fairy tales. He saw the steel beneath her grief, the cunning beneath her beauty. She was not like her father. She was like her mother, and that made her dangerous. The escape and the veil. When the time was right, Peter arranged for Sansa to escape King's Landing, smuggling her out after Joffrey's death. He took her to the Vale, to the one place where he held absolute power. Lisa Arryn, still hopelessly devoted to him, welcomed Sansa as her niece, but Peter had no intention of letting Lysa live much longer. Jealous, paranoid, and unstable, she was a liability. So with one gentle push, he sent her tumbling through the moon door. Sansa watched as her aunt disappeared into the abyss below. She did not scream. She was learning. The North remembers Peter now had control of the Vale, and with Sansa, a legitimate claim to the North. But as he maneuvered to place her as the true Lady of Winterfell, he realized something unsettling. She was no longer listening to him. She was making her own choices. And for the first time in his life, Petter Baelish felt something foreign. Not power, not control, doubt. Petter Baelish had spent his entire life climbing. Step by step, betrayal by betrayal, he had risen from nothing, a minor lord of the fingers, to the master of coin, to the lord protector of the Vale, to the shadow that guided the future of the North. But in the Game of Thrones, one misstep was all it took to fall, and Sansa Stark was no longer his pawn. Winter had come. The Boltons were defeated. Jon Snow had been crowned king in the north, and Sansa Stark stood beside him, not as a hostage, not as a victim, but as the Lady of Winterfell. Peter saw his position slipping. He had expected Sansa to need him, to trust him, to follow his guidance. But she had learned too well. She was playing the game now, and she was playing it against him. Still, he had one move left. Jon Snow was gaining too much power. The North adored him. The lords swore loyalty to him. If he bent the knee to Daenerys Targaryen, if he married the Dragon Queen, Sansa would be left with nothing. So, Peter whispered in her ear. "They love him now," he said softly. "But what happens when he leaves? When he forgets the North, just as Robb Stark did?" Sansa listened, but she did not answer. She had learned that silence was a weapon too. Still, Peter pressed on. He planted old betrayals between her and Arya, fed her doubts, tried to twist her against her own blood. If the Starks turned on each other, Winterfell would be his to shape. For a moment he thought it was working. Then Sansa called a gathering of the Northern Lords and the Knights of the Vale, and the trap closed. Peter stood in the great hall of Winterfell, his confidence wavering as Sansa's icy blue eyes bore into him. Arya stood beside her, a ghost from his past, her dagger at her hip. Bran Stark sat nearby, his vacant gaze distant, but knowing. Peter had arranged many trials before, but never had he stood as the accused. "You stand accused of murder and treason, Lord Baelish," Sansa said, her voice as calm as winter itself. He almost laughed. A mistake, a misunderstanding. Surely she was not turning against him, not after everything he had done for her. I don't understand," he stammered, forcing a smile. "My lady, I have only ever acted in your best interests." Sansa's voice did not waver. "You murdered my aunt, Lisa Arryn," she said. "You conspired to have my father executed. You betrayed my family again and again, and you thought I would not see it." Peter turned to the Lords of the Vale, seeking their support, but they did not move. For the first time he was alone. "No," he whispered. "Sansa, everything I did was for you." He dropped to his knees, his voice cracking. "I loved your mother. I loved you." Sansa's lips barely curled, not into a smile, not into a frown, just understanding. "You taught me how to play your game, Lord Baelish." She tilted her head. "And now I win." Arya moved like a shadow, her dagger flashing in the dim light. A quick, clean cut. Petyr Baelish collapsed to the ground, blood pooling at his throat. His hands clawed at his neck, his breath gurgling. But no one moved to help him. His vision darkened. His last sight was Sansa Stark, standing tall, looking down at him with the quiet, knowing gaze of a victor. The pupil had surpassed the master, and the Game of Thrones moved on without him. Petyr Baelish had spent his life climbing, but in the end, he had climbed too high, and he had fallen.